So, hi everyone. My name is Shane Evans. I'm one of the co-founders at GameDriver, and I'm joined today with Matthew Finitz from SciPlay, and we're going to be talking about the future of testing in gaming. Now, this time last year, when we presented for GameDevGuild, we talked about testing in a small studio, in a two-man studio, in fact, doing just indie game development on the side, nothing professional, and some of the gains that they saw in doing test automation as part of their development process. Today, we're going to hear from a professional, somebody who does this for a living, has been doing this for a long time, and understands kind of the pitfalls and the ins and outs of doing testing automation for actual game development in larger studios. And he's going to talk to us today about some of their some of the pitfalls, some of the things that they've encountered, and how to resolve those issues, as well as some of the benefits of doing test automation and why you might consider it as part of your development practice. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Shane. Pleasure to be here.
So before we jump in, I wanted to spend some time talking about kind of what we see in the marketplace. And so um, just to kind of set the stage for, why are we even talking about quality or test automation in gaming? And this is an emerging topic. It's something we're hearing a lot more about these days with talks of unionization in quality teams in different organizations to workplace conditions and things like that. But you can see from the data that's on the screen right now is we hired a well-known research organization, Omdia, who puts on the Game Developers Conference each year. They're part of the Informatech team. They went out and talked to a bunch of different studios, and what they found is that the number two concern among all studios was testing and quality assurance. And this is behind hiring the right talent and ahead of user retention and user acquisition, which are arguably tied to quality as well. How do you get customers? How do you get users? High quality game. How do you keep them? High quality game, right? I think most of us are pretty familiar with that. And so when we dug in a bit further, we saw that the majority of testing, to nobody's surprise, is largely done manually. So there is a mix of manual and automated testing, but from the breakdown, you can see that a lot of that testing is done manually as well. When we talk about the mix of manual and automated testing, or the even more automated end of the spectrum, we're talking about the more integrated unit testing, performance testing, those sort of dev-centric types of tests. The majority of regression testing and functional testing is still done manually across the board. And so one of the problems that we see is that as games develop and mature, the number of tests that are required to be performed increases almost exponentially, right? As we near that stage where we're going to release a project, the amount of testing that needs to be done to cover everything goes up significantly. The challenge is we only have a certain number of hands. We can only test one thing at a time, and therefore the amount of testing that can be performed by any team or group of individuals is very limited. So there, you can see there's a huge gap as we get towards the end of a cycle. And really, this amounts to game testers lacking the tooling in order to do anything other than test with their bare hands. So one of the things that we talk about a lot at GameDriver is how all of the tools before testing are mature and have followed the industry in terms of development and best practices, and all of the tools after testing have matured over the last many years. But Matt, you've come from a bunch of different studios. Is this consistent with what you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely. There's just so much gap in the tools that we have, testing and test automation wise. And it's gotten better over the last 10, 15 years, but you've seen the acceleration of dev tools and DevOps tools um, go pretty far, and test tools just sort of inkle behind.
Yeah. And when you talk about the concept of agile development, which is really important for things like live ops, where we're releasing new features on a regular basis, things like monthly content updates or seasonal updates. It really depends on this notion of agile development or DevOps, right? Which is, I know, somewhat foreign to some people in this space, but you and I have spent some time in different parts of the industry, and that's kind of the norm outside of gaming, right? This concept of agile development. short sprints, releasing on a frequent basis, having continuous testing, continuous automation, continuous deployment, and really having a manual process in the middle of that kind of breaks the whole concept.
It does, especially at certain scales. You can do so much risk assessment to try to shuffle your team around as fast as possible, but it has tipping points.
Sure. So I wanted to take a minute to talk a bit about that modern development lifecycle and what it should look like. A couple of animated slides here, so I promise not to get too slidey here, but we'll get into the meat of things. So we imagine this, sort of change in any sort of application development, and change being the delta, of course, is the triangle. You've got three aspects to that. You've got your time, your cost, and your quality. And the problem is that you can only choose two of these, right? So what that means is you can deliver faster at a reduced cost, but you're going to cover less and less with each cycle, right? So if you want to deliver very quickly, it's like let's just rapidly test and then go on to the next thing. And so your test coverage tends to decrease over time, but you are delivering faster. Quality, not so much. You can reduce your costs and increase your coverage, but that's of course going to take more time, right? As you add features to your application, your game, it's going to take more time to deliver that functionality with each and every release. And then if you want high quality and fast delivery, this tends to be very expensive. It means more people, more effort, more environments, having more places to do the testing across different form factors, different operating systems, different scale of PCs, for example. Like how do you test on today's hardware versus last gen's hardware, et cetera? This tends to get very, very expensive. And so the solution, as DevOps would have you follow, is to reduce the scope of changes, right? To have a very small number of changes with every cycle, every release. And that way we can automate the regression testing and execution of all of those tests in a very sort of systematic way. We're adding functionality, we're automating the test for that functionality, and then we're rolling it into production. Nothing gets passed into production without test coverage. And then we're removing the external dependencies, internal and external, I should say, because there are internal dependencies, and then there's things, especially in modern games, right? You've got connectivity to services that are doing leaderboards, they're doing monetization, you're doing advertisements, you're doing all of these things. Externalizing or removing these dependencies is really key. And so what we've seen for those companies, those teams that have adopted automation as part of their development process, is a huge improvement in their delivery times, the time to market, the quality cover or test coverage that they're able to deliver, and just overall the process itself is improved vastly. We even see improvements in employee satisfaction in these environments because they're getting more done rather than really stressing or crunching, as it were. Like there's all this talk of crunch. I've been in situations of crunch in my career, and I can tell you that automated testing is actually a solution. It's not the solution, it's a solution. It's a component factor in terms of resolving the problem with crunch. Because if we can reduce the amount of pressure that's put on testers and developers to deliver, especially as we get into those final stages of a release, everybody's happier, right?
Yeah, and it frees up their hands too, right? So it's like if there's less of this type of testing to do with more free hands to do the other type of reactive testing, really makes it much nicer.
Yeah. So I'd like to, again, switch gears. This is just sort of to set the stage, and we're going to talk about SciPlay. Why don't you tell us a bit about SciPlay?
So like it says, SciPlay is a leading developer and publisher of video games on mobile and web platforms, mostly casino-style games. Great team, great games, and great chance for automation for me.
And how long have you been with the company?
I've only been with the company 4 months, but I definitely handpicked very carefully.
What sort of put you down the path of test automation at SciPlay? Was that specifically why you were brought into the role?
It was. Typically when I go for interviews, because QA is such a mixed blend, and the SDET automation, manual QA thing is still sort of this rolling yarn ball. I typically go in and get interviews for like QA manager or like automation manager. But then when I hit the interview process, people sort of try to vet me. And in SciPlay's case, they noticed I had a really strong automation background with hands-on experience. And they crafted a test director of automation role for
Oh, wonderful. That's always
me.
nice.
Yeah, it is. Get some fine grained control.
um, and we kind of jumped into it quickly. What other companies have you worked for, just as a background?
Microsoft, Amazon, Adobe, Netflix, Zynga, Electronic Arts.
Wonderful. Um, Jumping in, we do have a video here, and actually, while this is playing, maybe you can talk us through kind of what we're seeing. We can get technical, or we can just talk about kind of the objective here. But I'm going to
Sure.
play and mute here so that startle anyone. And so, what kind of app? Like, what are we looking at first off?
So this is SciPlay's Jackpot Party. It's one of their biggest titles. It's a casino-style game, allows you to jump in, spin slots, and it's got that casino-like experience where you can move from room to room and so forth. Since it's one of their biggest titles, one of the things we wanted to do with automation was, hey, let's vet our automation program. First, let's build an automation roadmap, see what we want to build for the first year, and then let's vet it against our first title. So we took Jackpot Party and we took GameDriver. Thanks, big game there. And we just sort of, let's see what we can do with it and see how far we can get. And very quickly, within a few weeks, I think it was like 3 weeks to build our core framework. I mean, within a day, we were automating the game, and then we just sort of wrapped some good tools around that, utilities and APIs. But within about 3 weeks, we had Jackpot Party automated and moving right along. Here you see we're just spinning some slots and validating that spins go, and validating certain tiles are being updated with animations and such.
So this is a mobile game, yeah.
Correct. It's actually across multiple platforms, but primarily mobile.
Okay. And so you're running these tests as part of the build process, or at the end of the build process, you're saying like, hey, let's put it on some devices, or when does this
That's
happen?
correct. So alongside with GameDriver, we did some automation to integrate it with our CI/CD, so we have APIs in our automation framework that can download the builds, install the builds, launch the builds, and then once we launch the build, we get that application under test layer, and that's where GameDriver kicks in and starts doing the rest of the driving.
And I think we have a slide that kind of illustrates that afterwards. But I just wanted to kind of understand better. Well, while this is running, for those watching, this isn't just clicking things, right? Like this is checking behind the scenes, like what's happening when I interact with different elements on the scene.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like one of the best things about GameDriver and the sort of exposure you guys gave us is that it crawls through the Unity scene graph really well. And right now, where all these tests are running, I'm accessing several actual in-game objects in the runtime and checking their values and making sure things are doing, like certain values are set properly, executing methods on some of the game objects and so forth to do certain tricks. But yeah, it's moving right. Like it's great.
Any gotchas or challenges that you had to overcome in getting this up and running, or?
Not so much with GameDriver. There's with every game, there's the standard, like for example, there's like standard Unity button.
Yeah.
And it's like super easy to click on a Unity button. With GameDriver especially, you have the API, just click and boom. But we have special components in our games,
Right.
and some of those special components it's not just about accessing or invoking a method on the game object. It's about like literally working through some architectural issue. But even that challenge, I think that challenge took us a day, and then we were back in mainstream.
Awesome. Good. I didn't need to blur out your password there. That's good.
There was no password.
And so
I checked.
So you don't have a password for anyone who is paying attention. That's good. you've actually done work with other. I don't want to make this entirely about a game driver commercial, but you've done work with other frameworks and you've built your own in the past. Is that right?
Yeah. So in the past, I've had to actually do this myself.
Yeah.
So like with Netflix, 15 years ago at Netflix, when we were developing all the 10-foot UIs across all the devices, we needed something that could cross, and we needed sort of that application level access. So we wrote a version of a driver back then. That was before Selenium came in and kicked in. And
Oh wow.
there were some opportunities to do that. And then at Zynga, same thing, more Flash oriented than like WebDriver or WebKit, HTML oriented, but Flash oriented. Did a driver approach for all the Zynga games. At EA, similar approach for their mobile titles. And then at Amazon, games-wise, they use Lumberyard and other stuff, which I can't mention. But we did the same approach there to drive the games.
Wonderful. So yeah, I guess the question I wanted to ask is, how long does this take to run? Like, you have a suite of tests that are going to run, per build, per device, or something like that. How long does this take to run through automation, and how much time do you think it would take if you were to do this manually? Like, what's the delta there?
So this particular suite's a really small example.
Yeah.
This suite, I think, takes 6 minutes to run, but it covers multiple cases. I'd say the time for our automation framework, and particularly like underneath the performance of GameDriver driving the app, GameDriver's very fast.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had just general, curiosity at first, check the performance of the automation hooks you're using. And I found, I was like, wow, GameDriver responds really fast. So on top of that, it's more usability. Like, how long do I have to wait for a slot to spin? How long do I have to wait for purchasing, feedback from the back end to come back up to the UI or the system to pop up a notification? So most of that 6 minutes is just there. But test runtime is pretty similar, both manually and automated.
With the exception that you could run this in parallel, and that's the next slide. Is that the idea that you could take that same test and run it across all of your devices.
Right. And one thing I didn't mention, which I was just caught on at the end there, was like, it is the same as manual time, but there's more very technical details being asserted. So it might be the same time, but underneath the hood, there's about 5-10 more checks going on. Now, like you're saying about scale with the devices. Yeah, that's great. We, I initially did the first version and aimed it towards Android, just because I was working on a Windows machine.
And it's easier to get Android wired up in a lot of ways.
True story. And but taking it to iOS was just the Appium setup time, and we were back on top.
You still do require the underlying Xcode components in a lot of ways to control iOS devices. So it's unfortunate. It's the reality of it. A little more challenging. So I usually recommend, start with Android, get it working there, and then.
Yeah, I think the documentation's catching up as well. But like the biggest kink was getting the WebDriver rebuilt for the WebDriver app rebuilt for your iOS devices and figuring out what you want your profiles to be and such. But after that, it was just like, cool, it works, and it's pretty stable. And I haven't had any drops or sort of disconnects with it so far. So
wonderful. And I see you have here that it took about 3 weeks to get things set up. I want to take that as a transition to kind of the next slide, as to what it is that you've developed in time that you've been working with GameDriver. What does it look like from your perspective, and what does it look like from like an average tester that wants to implement something?
Right. Well, one of the key things about that slide before was that it's by using GameDriver. I know this sounds like a commercial, but it's not. It's just that, hey, it saved a bunch of time.
Yeah.
And so instead of having to work on lower level protocol and figure out how I want to parse my Unity scene graph and then expose that data and so forth, I could just jump in and build on top of that. And so in that 3 weeks time, we were able to build Jenkins integration, the Android integration, and then bits and pieces of the initial iOS integration. And then with that other free time, then we did stuff like this, where it's like, hey, not only do we want to be able to script against the game, we want to be able to do it in a way that's a little bit more cohesive. So let's spend some extra time developing like easier to write test scripts, giving them some structure and whatnot, so that not only are these test scripts more readable in the editor, like in the Visual Studio and IDE, but how easy is it for others to write scripts like this if we kept providing them APIs? Because overall, that then turns into a program where we can pass it on to manual QA and say, hey, who wants to learn to script or who has scripting knowledge? Let's try this out.
So just to clarify, what we're looking at here is not GameDriver code, but this is an abstraction that you've built that takes some of the commonly used functions and just makes it, jackpot party dot reset, log in with platform, proceed to lobby, etc. And underlying that, you have the GameDriver code that implements those.
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. And so you've got some times here. It takes 10 minutes. You're adding a new test. You kind of figured out the navigations and how to get around and identify objects and that sort of thing. The assertions are underlying that as well.
Correct. Yeah. There's definitely some patterns. Every company has its own little choice of patterns on how they want to do that, like sort of command assert. But in this framework, at this highest level of the scripting language, we wanted it to just sort of do what you want, and the assertions are taken care of in the sort of product business logic layer below that.
Wonderful. So I see we're running out of time, so I'm going to jump ahead a bit here. But so thanks for that. As just kind of a sort of wrap up on the solution side, and we'll leave the rest of the time for Q&A. Our goal was to provide sort of this cross-platform, cross-engine capability that would allow you to build this type of framework, right? So this is based on decades of experience in enterprise software testing, and myself and my colleagues who spent a lot of time in enterprise software, where we saw what worked, we saw what didn't work, and we borrowed some of those concepts that would particularly translate well into this space. So not everything, of course, but as a single solution, Unity, Unreal, Godot are supported for cross-platform execution, and we currently support iOS, Android, macOS, Windows, consoles like Nintendo Switch, Xbox. I know I'm forgetting some. WebGL is coming out in a few days, and more. Anywhere that the engine can go is our goal. So glad to hear that you've seen some success from that approach. As kind of a wrap up, some of the benefits, why it might matter to the audience, the GameDevGuild audience, is reduce the cost of testing, reduce the dependency on manual testing. Once you've built that automation, you check it in once, it's there. You don't have to, continually invest in that area over and over and over again. Sorry to keep hiding your head there. The obvious outcome to that is, lower potential defects. You're catching things that you wouldn't otherwise catch. Improve time to market. This is one that I get a lot of questions on because it might be counterintuitive, but the idea being that you invest upfront in the automation effort, and that's going to save you time in the execution down the road. As we saw in that initial slide, where the amount of testing that's required increases over time as games are developed, and this is going to help you shortcut that, or at least to meet that increase of functionality head on, rather than having things pile up towards the end. And it is a lower overall maintenance cost, right? People are expensive. And so whether your goal is to reduce your dependency on manual testing and testers, or to make your testers more efficient, which is what we see more often case, whether you're a small team with just a handful of people, developers and testers working side by side, or you're a large team and you have a dedicated group that's focusing on QA, our goal is to make them more efficient, not to reduce the number. Tester myself, that was sacrilege.
I would add one more, that the onboarding cost is very cheap too.
Yes.
Like picking up the automation and automating the Unity games was super fast. And I was like, cool, I don't have to do this anymore.
I appreciate that. That's a good point. So just to wrap it up, because we're right at the end of our time here, cross-platform, cross-engine test automation for anything developed in Unity and Unreal. Check it out. And we're here to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks, Matt, for your help. And
thanks, Shane.
We'll looking forward to hearing from everyone. Thanks.